at Flinders Medical Centre. He's got an extensive research background, particularly in preclinical and lab-based research. But today he's going to be talking to us about how high intensive care unit strain is associated with adverse mortality outcomes.
Thank you very much. Look, I'm here to talk about an observation, a hunch, and a feeling that if your ICU is under strain, you will lead to bad patient-related outcomes. I'm sure many of us would have had this feeling that there's no beds in ICU and there are sick patients waiting to come in either in the ED or ward, had a med call, you're waiting because there's no beds, there's ICU's full, and our nursing colleagues are not happy because they don't have staff, and what can you do then, right? And we all have this feeling that that would not be good for the patients, right? I'll come to this ICU strain. This is what we call ICU strain. And I'll come to the ICU strain in a second. But there's another concept called lead time, and this has been investigated a lot, that lead time is a difference in time from hospital admission to ICU admission. And there's obviously a complex interplay, because if your ICU is full, your lead time will be high, right? So there's a complex interplay in them. There's a lot of literature about lead time. Lead time is lead time. There's David Pilcher has done some work many years back looking at lead time delay from ED. There's some data from sepsis, and what they found was if you're sick, you get to ICU soon. If you're not sick, you get to later, essentially. But after more robust studies came out and showed that if you require intubation or dialysis prior admitting to ICU, lead time affected outcome. This is a data where patients were accepted for ICU admissions, but they were delayed because of possibly, we don't know, there was increase in risk, hazard ratio 1.5 times per hour. Whatever you make of lead time, it's already in the Apache scoring system. So Apache scoring system gives you a risk of death, and lead time is a part of the risk of death prediction model. Talking a bit more about the recent data, this actually is a very topical now, because I'll show you 3 publications last 2 months, all in major journals investigating this area. This was published in the Annals of ATS, which is a retrospective cohort study, 3 hospitals, and there was a 13% less chance of getting an ICU admission if your ICU bed is full. Makes sense, right? Doesn't make too much of a thing, but there's data to support it. And if you get admitted to ward because your ICU is full, you have increased mortality. This is data from Critical Care Medicine, again just recently published, single centers, retrospective cohort, 21-month patient data, that your ICU admission decisions are affected by medical bed availability. I mean, it's common sense, right? But this is data now to prove this common sense. And prolonged ED boarding time were associated with the first patient outcome, and there's a nice kind of a figure to support it. This is the data from intensive care medicine. I actually quite like this paper. This is actually ward patients, not ED patient, and what essentially it shows is if your ICU is full, the chances are you will die more in ward. If ICU have bed, the chances are you will die more in ICU. But anyways, that's what it shows. So this was the kind of background. If you see last 3 papers we published essentially last 2 months, so they are pretty topical. What we wanted to do, we know that lead time delay is established, accepted, leads to adverse patient outcomes. We wanted to describe the impact of ICU strain. On ICU strain, there's various ways of defining ICU strain, and we have looked at ICU bed occupancy on the association of lead time delay and mortality. We wanted to examine both ward and ED patients, and we looked at ANZIC's database. Our null hypothesis was this won't be affected by any ICU strain. There won't be any interaction between ICU strain and lead time. The method, this is a busy slide. I'll slowly go through it. We looked at data from January 2013 to December 2016 from 2 databases, from ANZIC's core database and the ANZIC's critical care resource utilization database. We looked at only the first admission to ICU from either from ward or from ED at 117 hospitals. Lead time is easy to define, time difference between hospital and ICU admission. ICU strain were classified as low, medium, and high based on number of beds available, time of admission, 2 plus 1 or 0 in 8-hour blocks. We used a logistic regression modeling to examine the association between lead time delay and risk of death. Now, we adjusted the risk of death for all the factors used in Apache except the lead time itself. Then we used an interaction term between lead time and ICU occupancy to examine the differential effect of ICU occupancy rate across different categories of lead time. The results are presented at odds ratio of adjusted mortality and examined separately for ward and ED admissions. Now, this is a flow chart. This is 4 years data. We had 347,859 patients. We limited data to those who came either from ED or ward. We excluded readmission, and we included patients who were only for active treatment. So we are left with 198,125 patients. They were divided from ED source and ward source. We did some bit of data clearing with only patient when we have data available. We have occupancy data available, ventilation data available, and we limited to hospitals who had at least 150 patients. So we are left with 122,538 patients from ED and 52,378 patients from ward. This is some of the demographic data. Essentially what I want to show here is that if a patient came from ward, they were older, they were sicker based on Apache 2 and Apache 3 scores, and they had a longer length of ICU stay. Coming straight to the results, if you're a hospital administrator, you'll be happy to look at these results because most of the ED admissions to the ICU happens within the 4 hours interval. But there is a significant number of patients who are admitted 4 to 8, 8 to 24, and more than 48 hours later from ED. And there was a U-shaped mortality curve. This curve is not new. It had been shown in the previous studies that if you're sick, you get admitted early to ICU, you have higher mortality, but there is a lead time delay effect. As you get later and later, there is increase in mortality. This is from ED. What about ward? Interestingly, ward patients, there's most of the patients admitted at later time interval, more than 48 hours or 1 to 2 days, probably because they go from ED to ward to ICU. And again, a U-shaped mortality curve with the most mortality. Remember this, most of the patients from the ward are admitted at around 48 hours later, and the highest mortality in that group. And this mortality rate is actually higher than the ED patients. Coming to the ED strain. Now, most of the admissions are happening to ED when ED is in the medium to high strain. That means they had only one bed or no beds available. I don't know how this is possible, but like in my ICU, we are funded for 28 beds. We have got 32 physical beds, and most of the time we're running at 33 to 34 patients. So inherently, we are always at high strain. So most of the admissions are happening in ANZ ICUs when the ICU is on the medium to high strain, and we found an increase in mortality rate when the ICU is under medium to high strain. This is ED data. What about ward data? Again, the similar kind of a signal. The most of the admissions are happening when the ICU is under medium to high strain, and there is an increase in mortality as you have goes from medium to high strain. When you put them together, yep. Now, this is a complicated graph. I'll just take my time. This on the x-axis is lead time to ICU. This is a more hospital mortality. And the red and the blue lines are the high and the medium occupancy rates. Mostly across all time frames of lead time delay, there is increase in mortality as your ICU is under strain, as ICU is under have less beds available. ED, same story with ward. Remember, the ward mortality is higher than the ED mortality. And so this is the main results, that high risk of death when ICU is under medium and high risk as compared to when the occupancy was low across all time frames of lead time delay. Now, there are some limitations of this data. Missing data, actually missing data was quite less because we had 4 years of data. It was less than 5% of missing data in this one. Now, next point is probably the major limitation. We don't have patient-level data at time of hospital arrival. We have time of ICU arrival, but not hospital arrival. There are other ways of classifying strain. One study didn't present. We actually looked at various ways of classifying ICU strain, and they found that the ICU available beds was the best way of classifying strain, and that's what we have used. Differences in ICU, look, this is a large study, and we will have ICUs with various kind of patient cohort and population, but we had 117 ICUs, and we limited ICUs with hospital with more than 150 patients, so we hope to have generalized that kind of limitation. Future work, we want to look at sick group of patients based on SOFA and Apache scores, various subgroups, ventilated, non-ventilated patients, and collaborate and publish this work. Just to conclude, ICU strain increases patient-centered outcome, hospital mortality across all lead time delays. I'd like to acknowledge the ANZIX Datathon. This is the first time I was there this year, and all the data presented today was a work of 2 days of just going through with various statisticians and data presenters of just doing data analysis for 2 days. It was a fantastic experience. I met a lot of good people who had much more ability than I did, and we did all this work in 2 days. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Shailesh. Good plug for the Datathon. Questions? I think Jeremy's hand might have gone first.
So could I ask that there's something I'm struggling a little bit with the the lead time concept as it relates to patients on the ward, because presumably when you come into ED, you've come in with the illness that requires you to go to ICU. So I understand that. But if you're on the ward, then you're admitted to the ward, and then at some point during that ward stay, you become ill enough to require ICU. So shouldn't the lead time really be from the time that illness is recognised to the time you get to ICU rather than the ward admission?
That's an excellent question. We have been wondering about this question ourselves. So look, that's why we want to do further subgroup analysis, because there is definitely a point where your patient was not sick when he came to the ward, or because ICU was full, he went to the ward. We don't know that. So, or he had a surgery done, he became sick after his surgery. So we want to do a very subgroup analysis of medical and surgical patient to start with, and based on Apache scores to start with. But based on data we have, we can only say longer you stay in the ward. If you get admitted to ICU, you have bad outcomes. We don't know, we don't have the patient level data at the time of the hospital admission, so we really can't compare those things. That can be probably done at a single center level, not at a center of 117, but I'm aware of that limitation. And that's something we want to address that in a subgroup based on the SOFA scores, Apache, or the medical or various diagnostic categories, which will predict that patient came in, had a big neurosurgery operation, and then he came to ICU. That means that was responsible for lead time delay. That's a very good point. That point has been addressed in the recent publication in intensive care medicine, though. And they looked at when you went from ED to ward, if your ICU was full, that was higher mortality. So that there are two angles to that.
Hi, just a fairly technical question. How was the ICU available beds calculated? Knowing both the APD and the CCR data quite well, there's available beds, ventilator beds and funded beds, and then there's also to work out your actual occupancy. I assume that's what you used.
No, excellent question.
Which does it take into account whether they're 1-to-1 or 1-to-2? So I'm just wondering.
So that's a good question. I mean, essentially, we went to the critical care resource utilization database, and we look at the number of funded bed as the thing, not as the total beds. So that's number one. Number two is we did an 8-hour census. It didn't have I cut off a lot of slides off because it was getting too crowded. It has more details in it. But essentially, we did an 8-hour census and look at number of patients in the ICU, number of funded bed available. As simple as that.
So just to echo what Jeremy said, I think the crucial metric there is going to be from time to decision of admission to actual admission, or time of MET call, depending on setting and so forth. My question is, did you find any effect of time of day, particularly admissions out of hours?
Oh, fantastic question. Actually, we looked into the Christmas time and school holidays time, and there is a fantastic graph showing how the Christmas affects you and how the Easter holidays affects you. It's a different question altogether, right? So it's not something in the part of this, but that we'll explore next time maybe. We had graphs, and I wish I had it now because it was there in my computer. But we had graphs how your kind of admission rates and everything dwindles down with these school holidays and stuff. We haven't looked at out of time, but there is a different question altogether, and it's been quite well investigated in the Blue Journal recently, where they looked at out of time, and that's how the whole thing about overnight ICU consultant comes in. It's not a new concept. But we actually looked at all the school holidays time and long weekends time, and there is a relationship, that's right.
Yeah, so just a quick question going back to Jeremy's point. I think there's a group of patients that come into hospital via ED, go to the ward, and then come to the ICU within a very short time frame, within a day or two of admission. And they've either got the wrong diagnosis or there's not an ICU bed available, something happens. But maybe you could split up the group that come from the ward to those that maybe within 48 hours of hospital admission and those who are a little bit longer.
Excellent suggestion. That's why we wanted to look at ventilated patients. We wanted data about ventilated patients in the first 24 hours, because if you're ventilated in the first 24 hours, inherently we're sick in the ward. So that's what we want. I mean, we don't have data at that point. I mean, when the first kind of event. Look, ward patients were less as compared to the ED patient who came to ICU, but inherently what can we do is from the database is our limitation, right? So we will look into patients who had a high renal function, for example, in ICU for the first 24 hours, or various subgroups of ventilated, non-ventilated, or high SOFA scores, and that's the best we can do because we don't have data prior to ICU if they came from the ward in a large data set like this.
Just last question, I'll be quick. There are two things. One is I believe that a lot of these results can be explained entirely on selection bias. One of the issues which is the companion to lead time bias is what I've called treatment failure bias in an editorial and critical in ICU medicine. What that is about is that what we do is you go and see patients in your outreach team and you see them and you treat them, and you treat them and treat them, and you only select out the bad ones. The other ones actually die, and they've got a much, much, much higher mortality rate purely by that selection. And the other thing is that when your ICU is full, you are actually keeping patients out who are less likely to die. And we know that New Zealand ICUs have got under more strain than Australian ICUs, and on the APD database we've got a higher mortality. And that may well just be because we are actually not the denominator, the end bit at the bottom of the equation is different because you've got different populations.
So there you go, the data you've got support now that the high ICU strain has increased mortality implication for your hospital administrators. But just coming to the first point, that there is a treatment failure, yes there is. And whether outreach teams saw and then they could died in the ward, that's what the intensive care medicine paper was, that if your ICU is full, your chances of dying in the ward is higher than chances of dying in ICU. Whether it's better to die in the ward and die in ICU, I don't know. That's a different philosophical question, but that's what the data will tell you. But you're absolutely right that if your ICU under stress, you will shift patient quickly from ICU because you need beds. There is a different question about bed blocks in this because that will also implicate a kind of affect all these findings, because if you're bed blocked and you don't have beds, then it's highly irritating, as we all know. That is a patient in the ward who had a med call, blood pressure 70, or you're giving fluid boluses there and killing them, and you can't get patients out. But it's a different question altogether, but a valid point.
Right, and so that concludes the session. Thank you very much. And we'll see you all at tea, and thanks to all the speakers again.